Welcome back to Beyond Psychology. I'm Adam Beatty, or Captain Dead Moth, and my sidekick Couch here. All of it's arbitrary. Today we're going to be approaching an issue that likely mainstream sports psychology doesn't want to address due to cognitive bias. That's why this channel exists. Now for a bit of a disclaimer. Keep in mind that my intention is to make us aware of these facets of our behavior so that we can prevent them from affecting our lives. I implore you to escape the brainwashing and remember that it's not your fault personally. We are all products of our environment. What that statement really means is that our personality and our behaviors are often learned. Before we look at the personality trait and the effects it has on society, let's take a look at the origins from a view of history. We don't have to get too detailed in this, but do some research on these subjects spoken of, if so inclined. So we must first examine the origins of games, as games is where sports originated. Games were created long ago, before Rome was established, just to give you an idea of the time frame. Other areas of the world had manifestations of what we would call games, and I'm not clear as to when those games emerged or in what cultures. We are just talking about the Western world here at the minute. During this period, there was an issue with having enough food in the Kingdom of Lydia. A kingdom-wide initiative was established. The rulers cleverly devised a dice game. One day, the people would eat, and the next day, they would fast and play the dice game. The people were distracted from their hunger with the game. Did you hear about the Korean guy who got so immersed in StarCraft, I think it was, that he refused to get up and go take a shit? Well, it killed him. True story. Go look it up. That's some hardcore shit there. Anyway, the people of Lydia survived the famine for 18 years in this way. Imagine if they had had StarCraft. Eventually, populations of the villages increased to the point where some people had to go and find new places to settle. Then the dice game was used to decide who would stay and who would go on this peerless journey to discover new habitats. The people who embarked on this journey ended up establishing Rome. Then those Romans, many years later, came back across the land, conquering all the villages and forcing the villagers to become Romans. As an interesting side note, the Romans stole a piece of each of those pagan religions and incorporated it into their own religion, and then forced all the pagans to adopt their religion. And because there was something recognizable within that new religion, it was easier for the villagers to accept this new rule. So then the Roman rulers had religion as a tool to instill perception of reality into the majority, and thereby having a way to manipulate and or control the Tier 4. Now the people can be enslaved both mentally and physically. But there was still time that the people had available to think freely, and as we know from religious ideologies, idle hands and all that. So games came in as a perfect tool for distraction. The Colosseum was built, and the games were solidified into our culture. Now we fast forward to modern day, and we can observe the monkey see, monkey do emulations of the previous Tier 5 consciousness by the modern expressions of Tier 5 consciousness. The same tactics are being implemented because these tactics are the path of least resistance. Why create a new method of manipulation when they can just adapt an old one to our modern world? It may have been the initial intentions of sports and or games to merely distract the people in their free time, but it's likely that many of the psychological manipulations that Tier 5 manipulators impose do not always yield the outcomes that are predicted and or wanted. Likely, they get some behaviors they wanted, some behaviors they didn't want, and then some behaviors they did not predict, but they ended up appreciating after all. Then the path of least resistance dictated they would take advantage of the happy accidents. In the Western world of the individualist, the land of self-indulgence and excessive ego, sports-driven mentality is quickly accepted by the forms of consciousness that exist within that perceptual paradigm. With the concept of excessive individualism as a product of our limited biological sensory information and religious brainwashing fortifying the self with concepts of an eternal soul, as well as the concept of being special or created. The innate parameters for the creation of a placebo drug are inserted. Now we can inflate the ego with the concept of winning. Addiction to winning is addiction to dopamine, not much different than an addiction to many drugs, which also facilitate dopamine much of the time. Now bear in mind that games and sports are handed to us as soon as we have the ability to comprehend the functions and make the psychological associations to ego inflation and us versus them for the purpose of achieving a win over another perceived separated life form. When we get to school, we are immediately pitted against our fellow students with the individualized grading system, which is really no different than a score in a game. Then we have gym class, where us versus them and excessive competition for the purpose of chasing a win is again lathered on our brains. The Tier 5 manipulators and/or rulers realized that there was more that could be done with this tactic of psychological manipulation than just distracting people from how badly they were being enslaved. These games and sports could be used to create certain personality traits and/or behavioral expressions that were helpful for capitalistic and military-industrial endeavors. The excessively competitive personality traits that we are conditioned with create economic slaves that are always chasing a win. They are ready to compete against other slaves to acquire pats on the head from authority. Within a structured game of economics, real-life monopoly, we are the board game pieces. Then there is the cultivation of perception, of us versus them, and crushing the enemy. Be aggressive. Be aggressive. In school, the finest of our sports warriors are put up on a pedestal. It is often the first item on the agenda when we get to school. Who won the game and who scored what goals towards that end are listed as a massive ego inflation and a reward from authority for winning the perceived game. Now think about this for a second. We do not retain much of what we learn from the public school system because it's use it or lose it, and most of what we've learned we don't use. So what are we left with? We are left with the conditioning that was seared into our brains through excessive repetition. The knowledge we were absorbing was always changing, and there was so much of it that it is impossible to remember it all. But the framework of which we learned it, and the comparative between us versus our fellow classmates, as well as the continual force-fed sports agenda, was always present. So the sports-driven mentality becomes a programmed personality or behavioral expression. We can observe this in almost every person that we interact with because they likely went through the same systems of conditioning within our public school education system, which is mandatory by law in most places, I must point out. Even people who are homeschooled are still exposed to many of the people who are products of the established system, and the behavioral expression is passed virally through status quo-driven acceptance and emulation to achieve a certain level of social survival. Act a certain way and you get positive feedback, and then you create the status quo. That's how it works. Then there is the high school debate team bullshit, which is an extension of sports-driven mentality. I'd also like to point out that it is an opinion that debate is a rational discourse for critical examinations, and regardless if it yields any productive answers in particular puzzles that we are trying to solve, we don't see anybody questioning whether debate is reasonable or not, or if there's a more productive form of discourse available as an alternative. People want to chase that win, so they make intellectual banter into a sport. I'm sure you all know somebody like this. And if you get on social media, it's almost the only interaction you will experience. Hence the name ARGU-TUBE, high school debate team bullshit. Now most people do not become soldiers or professional athletes, so the only use of the excessively competitive sports-driven brainwashing is for economic slavery, or so-called conversations with each other, which are actually not conversations at all, but we'd like to label them a debate, but in most cases we can't actually label them debate because there is no structure established, there were no judges, nobody even asked the other person if they wanted to have a debate, but rather it's nothing more than an argument between ignorant and irrational dopamine-chasing ego addicts. Attack, defend, this versus that, winning, losing. There's very little productive discourse on any of social media for that matter. I've studied this behavior thoroughly. The people I was studying have no idea that they're being studied either. They just think I'm another idiot for them to attempt to have a debate with. I've entertained people's debate many times in order to study their thought processes and understand how they arrive at a conclusion. The majority of the time, these people are not critical thinkers, and they are riddled with logic fallacy and cognitive bias to the point where there is absolutely nothing productive coming from their minds. Diarrhea of the mouth is evidence for shit for brains. It's very typical for both parties involved to be suffering suffering from cognitive bias because they want to win or justify some belief that they have rather than increasing their knowledge or finding truth out of the equation. I observe that the majority of the population attempts to oversimplify every subject to a this versus that, so they can create the framework for their high school debate team bullshit game. When in reality, most topics are a complex, multi-dimensional equation that cannot be reduced to a this versus that. If someone makes a statement and it's not in line with their belief system, then they make a hasty judgment, more logic fallacy. There's also an aspect of biology where we are taking the path of least resistance and perpetuating mental laziness as a product of that. Again, evolved to save calories. It's easier to be right and argue about it than it is to accept that we don't know something. If we accept we don't know something, then there's a lot of hard work to be done.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
I also studied what happens when they perceive they've lost, and there are other people that may observe this loss. They become irrational and facetious, what I refer to as a debate troll. They grasp at straws and use anything they can desperately, like a Neanderthal wielding a club. After I had my fill of studying these thought processes by entertaining these childish and primitive games, I decided that I would start telling them the truth of the matter, while at the same time refusing to play their game of high school debate team bullshit. Their reactions are almost always the same. If they see that you refuse to have a debate with them, then they will do their best to goad you into that debate. They will try to insult you and paint you in a negative light in some fashion in hopes that others that are observing will agree with them and join in. Once they make you feel insecure, they are confident you will then entertain their game and let them chase their win, get their dopamine fix. It's very common that they use the concept of ad hominem as an ad hominem, which I find especially amusing. The different types of logic fallacy that they display will increase in number. They will start cherry-picking anything they possibly can to create any debate, even though it has nothing to do with the initial item they attempted to start an argument over. They will even attempt to argue with you that debate has value because you have refused to respond to their initial instigation. It is just as much pathetic as it is irritating and disheartening for someone like me. When I'm observing two people having this interaction, I see two children having a fight on the playground. I don't see two adults having reasonable discourse. Regardless of how arbitrarily people like to distinguish the difference between argument and debate, the only real difference between an argument and a debate is emotional investment, outbursts, or what I like to call the Bill O'Reilly, and whether or not there's any real structure involved. So a debate is really just an argument where both people act fake by suppressing any emotional attachment they may have to the subject. For the elitists that manipulate the majority, they are likely very pleased that everyone is busy arguing opinions with each other rather than consolidating on the facts of the matter. In this state, the people are in a form of mass ever-transmuting cognitive dissonance. This is the age-old divide and conquer strategy that keeps us from consolidation. We fail to focus on freeing our minds from the paradigms of enslavement by the Tier 5 manipulators. Now think about curriculum. It hasn't changed much in the ages. Do you really think that nobody in power noticed how crap our schools were and what was really being produced here? It's no accident things are not changing. Public schools are not teaching people how to think with evidence-based reasoning and cause and effect analysis, but rather teaching them to argue weightless opinions and remember a bunch of random facts like a walking shit container Wikipedia page. Or what I also refer to as a glorified Jeopardy contestant, a memory specialist, a programmable robot. This is all part of how Tier 5 consciousness is dumbing down the masses. Most likely not something they intended, but once it happened, they observed it to be helpful and continued to cultivate more of it. Now, the media has a role to play here also. Like I said, multi-dimensional cause and effect analysis here. Today, many people are some sort of hodgepodge of sports-driven mentality and Jerry Springer soap opera personality traits. The consciousness that exists currently is wasting its focus on hollow wins and constantly searching for a new game to play. We must associate our dopamine releases with other aspects of the experience rather than winning or losing. There's always room for us all to grow, and as I am on this ride with all of you, I cannot exclude myself from these constructive criticisms and condescension. Much of what I propose on this channel takes a great deal of effort for us to examine thoroughly and understand, and it takes time to correct our behaviors. We are all on different stages of this journey, which creates different instances of incompatibility between our forms and personalities or behavioral expressions. We must take note of these incompatibilities in order to identify where we must grow and adapt. If you're interested in a better way to communicate and think, then I recommend the series called What School Curriculum Fails to Teach Us, and here's the link in the top right. When people go to argue with each other, I quickly identify they have not spent very much time improving their abilities for critical thinking and understanding cognitive bias as well as logic fallacy. As I've spent a great deal of my life dedicated to improving these abilities, their blatant disregard to improve those skills, that is displayed by their diarrhea of the mouth, I find to be very insulting, as they are actually unknowingly pissing all over my hard work and devaluing what it is that I do. It's like they're saying that they have a magical ability to just know the correct answer without ever having to grow their minds and do any research. In all fairness, people do not have the time and are very distracted, like by sports, so they aren't even aware that they should be taking this endeavor on. And combined with their ego, they have trouble admitting their weaknesses. Certainly, nobody dare point out that they don't know what they're talking about. I think they perceive that in itself as some sort of loss. So the next time your instinct is to immediately argue, reflect a second and identify the right questions that need to be asked in order to better understand the perspective that is being displayed. Then identify whether you disagree because of an opinion or because of facts and evidence. You can only do this once you truly understand what the other person is saying. If you disagree because of a fact and evidence, then offer that fact and or evidence and ask the expression of consciousness that is displaying said perspective if they are aware of this particular fact or evidence. And what do they think it means? Lastly, here's a tip that will help you win every debate if that's something you're interested in. When you master the skill of identifying when you don't know what you're talking about, and you can admit it, then you're never going to be wrong about anything ever again. Because you'll just say, I don't know. It's that simple. Then you can look at possibilities with open minds, rather than having a fight over it. Okay, thanks so much for taking the time to expand your understandings. Additionally, I wish you much luck in making the necessary changes, if need be, and helping others to do the same, with the goal to change our mass psychological state to something that doesn't suck ass. Again, another reminder, if any of the statements I make piss you off, well, that's how you know that I'm telling you the truth, and that nobody in your everyday life actually does tell you the truth. They're likely just complacent and trying to make sure everybody gets along, and they don't want to deal with the confrontation, or it's too much trouble to teach you how to think, and they don't have time to deal with it. It's that sort of thing. So here I am, attempting to give you what the world seems to refuse to give you. I am reporting my findings, which is like the weatherman reporting that it's going to rain tomorrow. And you're not going to be angry at the weatherman, are you? Okay then. Reminder, don't get all facetious debate troll with me and then have some sort of modern day metaphorical public stoning. Help to perpetuate the thought revolution. Help to manifest a higher state of consciousness. I know I'm making the most unpopular YouTube videos in the history of YouTube, but please, subscribe, share, and thumb up. Alright, have a good one, fellow consciousness of the universe.